There is nothing more terrifying in aviation than a perfectly good airplane flying into the ground. No engine fires, no system failures, just a crew fighting an invisible enemy. When you fly into pitch black, your inner ear stops telling you the truth. A level flight feels like a deadly climb, and if a pilot trusts their gut instead of their gauges, the plane doesn't stand a chance. These are the crashes where the plane was never the problem. We were. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. The captain of this flight had spent more than 20 years learning to read one kind of instrument, and only 3 learning to read another. On a black, drizzling night over Switzerland, those 2 ways of seeing the world would collide inside his head, and 10 people would pay for it. The strangest part is that nothing was wrong with his airplane at all. Every gauge worked. The engines ran true. The trap was buried in the difference between how a Soviet pilot and a Western pilot are taught to picture the sky. The flight was a short evening hop, a small Swedish-built turboprop carrying 7 passengers and 3 crew from Zurich to Dresden. Crossair, the airline, was a Swiss success story, but it had grown so fast that it could not find enough local pilots to fill its cockpits, so it reached east, hiring aviators from the former Soviet Union and the old Eastern Bloc. The captain that night was one of them, a Moldovan with around 8,500 hours, almost all of it on Soviet machines like the Antonov and a crop-dusting biplane. He had come to the Saab only 3 years earlier. Beside him sat a young Slovak first officer, capable and cheerful, but new to the airline and, as it turned out, never properly trained to work as half of a team. To understand what happened, you need to know one small, deadly thing about the instrument that tells a pilot which way is up. It is called the attitude indicator, a little display with a line for the horizon and a symbol for the airplane. On Western aircraft like the Saab, the airplane symbol stays fixed while the horizon line tilts behind it, exactly as the real world looks through the windscreen. But on the Soviet aircraft this captain had flown for 2 decades, it worked the opposite way. There, the horizon stayed level, and the little airplane symbol rolled instead. The 2 instruments showed the very same maneuver in mirror image. For a pilot raised on one, reading the other under pressure is like trying to write with the wrong hand. The takeoff was normal, less than a minute into the climb. In cloud and darkness, the controller offered them a small shortcut, telling them to turn left and head directly to a navigation beacon. It was a routine, friendly change, but it set the trap. The first officer, hurrying, punched the new destination into the flight computer without telling it which way to turn. The computer did what such machines do and picked the shortest path, which happened to be a turn to the right, the opposite of what the controller had asked. The captain, following his instruments, obediently began rolling to the right, and here the night unraveled. While the first officer kept his head down, busy with the engines and the computer, his eyes off his instruments for too long, the captain's gentle right turn kept steepening. By the time the young man looked up, the airplane was banked alarmingly to the right and still rolling. He tried to warn the captain, but his English was awkward and the words came out wrong. What he meant was that they were supposed to be turning left. What the captain heard was that they were already turning left. That single misunderstanding was fatal. The captain believed he was in a left turn, as his first officer seemed to be telling him. His own instrument, the Western one, showed a steepening turn to the right, and in that moment of stress and confusion, his mind reached back 20 years and read the display as if it were Soviet, which made it appear to show a turn to the left. Everything now agreed on a lie. Convinced he was rolling dangerously left, he did the natural thing to fix it. He rolled further right. The bank deepened. The nose dropped. The turboprop began to corkscrew down out of the clouds, picking up speed, and the captain, fighting what he thought was an uncontrollable roll to the left, kept feeding in exactly the wrong correction. The first officer knew. He could see the truth and his voice rose toward panic, shouting at the captain to turn left, but he never did the one thing that might have saved them. He never took the controls. He had never been trained to believe he could seize an airplane from a captain, and so he stayed an assistant to the bitter end, shouting a warning that only deepened the confusion, while the man beside him flew them into the ground. Less than 2 minutes after takeoff, the airplane slammed into a field near a small town, just a few miles from the airport, at enormous speed. The impact was so violent that it dug a crater in the earth and left almost nothing recognizable behind. All 10 people aboard died at once. In the wreckage, investigators found something unsettling in the captain's flight bag, a Soviet tranquilizer his partner had sent him to help with sleep, and for a while they wondered if drugs had brought the airplane down. They concluded in the end that they had not. The real causes were quieter and more troubling. An airline that hired pilots from a very different flying tradition without ever checking whether they could safely make the leap. A captain never retrained to read his instruments the new way. or to trust the autopilot instead of his own hands. It was everything around the machine, the training, the teamwork, the assumptions that had quietly failed and left two confused men to spiral a healthy airplane into a Swiss field in under 2 minutes. This airplane had been trying to warn its pilots for 7 years. 65 times, crews had written up the same fault in its logbook. 61 times, they had reported the same strange behavior in the air. And every single time, the engineers cleaned a few connectors, ran a quick test that always passed, and signed it back into service, never realizing they were chasing a ghost that would eventually kill 62 people. There was a real, physical flaw hiding in this jet. But the deeper failure was a budget airline that never bothered to find it, and pilots who were no longer watching closely enough to catch it when it struck. The flight was a short domestic hop across Indonesia, an aging Boeing 737 leaving Jakarta on a January afternoon in 2021, less than half full, with 62 people aboard. Both pilots were highly experienced on the type, with thousands of hours between them. The weather was ordinary, a few scattered storms, nothing alarming. 2 minutes after takeoff, climbing through the clouds, the captain eased back the planned rate of climb, and the automatic throttles began to pull the engines back to match. This is the most routine thing in the world. It happens on every flight. But on this jet, it was the trigger. As the automatic system moved to reduce power, the left engine's thrust lever slid back as commanded, but the right one stuck fast, jammed by friction deep in its linkage. Now one engine was winding down while the other stayed near full climb power, and the airplane began to feel that imbalance as a steady push toward the left. The autopilot quietly fought it, turning the control wheel further and further to the right to hold the plane on course. A safety system should have caught this and switched the throttles off, but a faulty sensor kept it from triggering. And so the imbalance grew, silent and invisible, while the two pilots looked at storms and talked to controllers and never noticed the wheel cranking over in front of them. This was the quiet heart of the disaster. Nothing was alarming, nothing demanded their attention. To catch the problem, a pilot only had to do the most basic thing in his job: scan his instruments, glance at the engine readings, notice the control wheel turned hard to one side. For a full minute, neither man did. The airplane slowly stopped turning right, leveled its heading, and then began to roll the other way, sliding into a left bank that no one had asked for and no one saw. They were in cloud, with no horizon out the windows, and the only place the truth lived was on the panel they were not reading. At 35 degrees of bank, an alarm finally spoke. Bank angle, it called. The captain looked up, startled, and in that instant the trap closed. He had spent the last minute believing the airplane was turning right, the way he had commanded. His mind told him that if anything was wrong, it must be banking too far right. So when the alarm jolted him, he grabbed the controls and rolled further left, deeper into the very bank that was already killing them. He held it there for only 4 seconds, but 4 seconds was enough. The 737 rolled past 90 degrees and turned over onto its back. Even then, it could have been saved. The data showed the captain begin to roll back the right way, and had he simply kept leveling the wings, the airplane would have recovered, and this story would never have been told. But he made the deadliest mistake in all of upset recovery, the one drilled into every pilot never to make. While the airplane was still upside down, he hauled the nose up, inverted. Pulling up does not raise the nose toward the sky. It drives it straight down toward the ground. The jet whipped through a full roll and came out pointed almost vertically at the sea, plunging at a speed no airliner is built to survive. The captain fought to pull it level in those final seconds, but there was no height left. Sriwijaya Air Flight 182 struck the shallow waters of the Java Sea and was gone. Just 25 seconds had passed since the first alarm. All 62 aboard died on impact. The investigation peeled back layer after layer of rot. The mechanical fault was real, a sticking throttle and a bad sensor that had gone undiagnosed for 7 years because the airline's engineers kept reaching for the easiest fix instead of the right one, never realizing the problem kept coming back. The recorders showed the same imbalance had happened on this very airplane many times before, often unnoticed by the crews, almost never reported. One of those earlier events had even been flown by this same captain, who had wrestled the airplane back under control and then never told a soul. And the upset recovery training that should have saved him on his last flight turned out, when investigators sat in on a session, to be so garbled that the instructors themselves did not seem to understand it. So this was not really the story of a broken throttle. The airplane, in the end, did only what a long-neglected machine eventually does. It was the story of an airline that ran safety on a budget, of warnings ignored for the better part of a decade, and of two experienced pilots who, in clear air with a minor and fixable problem, simply stopped flying their airplane until it was far too late to start again. The man in the left seat had never once flown a go-around in a real airplane. He had practiced the maneuver a handful of times in a simulator years earlier, a machine that cannot reproduce the forces a body actually feels, and that was the sum of it. On paper, he was a Boeing 737 captain. In truth, he had been a navigator for most of his career. His pilot's license rested on training that investigators could find no proof had ever happened, and he had reached the rank of captain through a system that cared only that the right papers carried the right stamps. On a dark November night over the Russian city of Kazan in 2013, that hollow system would finally come due, and 50 people would pay the bill. The flight was a short hop from Moscow, a 737 barely a third full, 50 souls aboard, among them the son of the president of the region they were flying home to. From the start, small things went wrong. A navigation error left the airplane several kilometers off course, and as they neared Kazan, the captain tried to salvage a sloppy, badly lined-up approach rather than admit defeat. He cut a corner, overshot the runway centerline, and ended up so far out of position that landing became impossible. With a powerful passenger aboard and clear, calm weather, the thought of failing to land at his own home airport clearly gnawed at him, but there was no choice. As they crossed the runway far too high, the first officer said it plainly, "Go around." It should have been the easy part. The captain pressed the go-around switches, the engine surged, and the airplane began to climb. But a 737, with its engines slung low beneath the wings, naturally wants to pitch its nose up hard when full power comes on, and the pilot is supposed to push forward to hold it at a sensible angle. The captain did not. He seems to have believed wrongly that the autopilot was flying the climb for him, even as an alarm announced that the autopilot had switched off, so no one was truly minding the nose. It rose through 15 degrees, then 20, then 25, the airplane pointing ever more steeply at the sky, while its speed bled away, and its first officer, distracted by a needless radio call from the controller, failed to notice how bad it had become. When the captain finally looked up and realized they had soared past their target height and were still climbing, he shoved the nose down to stop it. And here, the trap closed, the same cruel trap that has killed so many before. As he pushed over, the airplane went light, the force in everyone's bodies dropping towards zero and then below it, the sickening sensation of being lifted out of your seat. In the blackness, with no horizon outside, and his eyes off his instruments, that feeling told the captain a terrifying lie. It felt as though the airplane had pitched violently up and was tumbling over backward. Every instinct screamed at him to push the nose down harder to stop the imaginary tumble. So he did. He shoved the control column all the way to its forward stop. The 737 rolled over into a near vertical dive and plunged toward the earth. The crew had a few seconds, no more. The ground proximity system shrieked at them to pull up. The first officer cried out his captain's name, asking where they were going. There was no time to make sense of it. The airplane dropped 2,000 feet in moments and slammed nose first into the ground beside the runway at enormous speed, exploding on impact. A security camera caught the whole thing, a bright streak falling out of the night and a fireball blooming in the dark. All 50 people aboard died instantly. For a long time afterward, there was a fight over why. Some insisted the airplane must have broken, that some failure in the controls had doomed it, but the recorders were clear. Every control surface had moved exactly as the pilots commanded. The machine had done nothing wrong. What had failed was everything behind the machine, and it went far deeper than two unlucky men. When investigators pulled on the thread of the captain's career, the whole garment unraveled. His original flight training, the foundation of everything, appeared never to have taken place at all, yet his license had been approved anyway. Its date quietly backdated to hide that the school had lost its accreditation. His English was barely elementary, though papers certified it as advanced, and he had almost certainly cheated to pass his written exams. His type rating school passed every single one of nearly 300 students who came through, never failing anyone, because the point was not to produce pilots, but to produce certificates. His airline drowned in debt, drove its crews far past legal duty limits, and erased the excess hours from their logbooks. His recurrent training was a sleepless overnight formality, signed off as complete whether it happened or not. At every step, somebody had a job to do, and that job was to stamp a piece of paper and pass the problem along. Whether the man could actually fly was always somebody else's problem. So this was never really the story of a single bad pilot on a single bad night. It was the story of a perfectly good airplane handed to a man the system had failed to train, dressed up in all the right paperwork and none of the right skill. And the moment that fragile illusion met a situation that demanded a real pilot, it shattered and took 50 people down with it. The jet was sound to the very end, It was the human being inside it who had been hollowed out long before he ever sat down in that seat. Flash Airlines was a small Egyptian charter company that ferried European tourists to the beaches of Sharm el-Sheikh and back. Its safety record was shaky enough that Switzerland had already barred the airline from its airspace. But the Boeing 737 that pulled away from the gate in the small hours of that January morning in 2004 was mechanically sound, and aboard it were 148 people, most of them French families flying home by way of Cairo and then Paris. In the left seat was a captain with thousands of hours behind him, much of it in his earlier career flying fighter jets. Beside him sat a young first officer with very little experience and a quiet, deferential manner. It was still pitch dark when they lifted off, around 4:45 in the morning. The airport sat on the coast, and the climb out took them out over the Red Sea, away from the lights of the town and into a void. This is one of the most treacherous things a pilot can do. Take off at night over open water, because the sea and the sky merge into a single black wall with no horizon to separate them. There is nothing out there for the eyes to hold on to. In that darkness, the only truth a pilot has is the instruments on the panel in front of him, and the discipline to believe them over his own body. Just after takeoff, the captain began a gentle turn to the left, as the departure required, and called for the autopilot. What happened in the next few seconds has been argued over ever since, but the recorders told the essential story. The autopilot did not behave the way the captain expected. It is likely that it switched into a mode he had not anticipated, and for a moment he was puzzled by it, even remarking aloud that he did not understand what the airplane had just done. His attention dropped to sorting out the automation, and while his mind was busy with that small puzzle, the airplane did something he failed to notice. It began to roll the other way, to the right. That roll should have been easy to catch. It was right there on his instruments, the artificial horizon tilting further and further over, but the captain was not looking at it, and out the windows there was only blackness to betray it. The young first officer saw the bank grow and called out a warning that they were rolling too far. It was the right call, and it was not enough. He did not take the controls. He did not push hard. He simply voiced his concern and deferred, as he always had, to the senior man beside him. And the senior man was not processing it. The right bank kept steepening. The first officer's warning hung in the air unanswered. By the time the captain finally grasped that something was badly wrong, the airplane had rolled past 90 degrees, tipped beyond vertical, the wings pointing nearly straight up and down. From there, with the lift no longer holding it in the sky, the 737 simply fell. It dropped out of the night and into the Red Sea barely 3 minutes after leaving the runway, striking the water at enormous speed. All 148 people aboard were killed instantly. It lay in a tight cluster on the seabed, the mark of an airplane that had hit the water hole, not one torn apart by any device. This was not an attack. This was an airplane that had been flown into the sea. The investigation became one of the most bitterly contested in modern aviation. The American and French experts concluded that the captain had suffered spatial disorientation, losing his sense of which way was up in the dark, distracted by the automation, while his undertrained co-pilot proved unable to save him. The Egyptian side rejected this, insisting some mechanical fault must have jammed the controls, and the two camps never reconciled. The maintenance records that might have settled it had gone down with the airplane, with no copies kept. But whichever way the dispute is read, one fact never moved. For long seconds, an airplane that could fly perfectly well rolled steadily toward disaster, and the two men in the cockpit, one distracted and one too timid to act, did nothing to stop it until there was no sky left beneath them. Within 2 months, Flash Airlines was gone, bankrupt, its name remembered only for the night it left so many empty seats in an arrivals hall in Paris. For 2 hours, in the dead of night, the airplane circled in the dark above the storm. Below it, the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don was being raked by a near hurricane-force wind, and one airliner after another had given up and flown away to land somewhere safer. This crew kept waiting. They had plenty of fuel, a backup airport ready, and a simple plan. Hold until the weather broke, and if it did not, leave like everyone else. There was nothing wrong with their judgment, nothing wrong with their airplane, and nothing wrong with their skill. And yet, when they finally tried to land, all 62 people aboard would die in a way that baffled investigators for nearly 4 years. The flight was a budget red-eye from Dubai, a Boeing 737 barely a third full, carrying mostly Russians and Ukrainians home. In the left seat was an experienced captain from Cyprus. Beside him, a first officer from Spain, both of them careful and conscientious men. From the moment they neared Rostov, they did everything by the book. The weather was atrocious, full of violent wind shear, and on their first approach, the warning system told them to abandon it. They climbed away cleanly, then settled into a holding pattern to wait it out. Hour after hour they circled, watching other flights divert, debating their options, planning every contingency. By the time they decided to make one final attempt, it was past 3 in the morning, deep into the hours when the human body most wants to sleep and the human mind is least sharp. Neither man had flown to this airport before. The storm was still raging. The risk that night was high, and though they had weighed it carefully, they may not have grasped just how high. On that last approach, a powerful gust of wind slammed into the airplane head-on and shoved its speed far beyond what was allowed. The captain made the right call and announced a go-around. But here lay a subtle, fatal surprise. The crew had spent the whole night rehearsing one specific kind of emergency climb, the maneuver for escaping wind shear, where you ram the engines to full power and leave everything hanging out for drag. Now they were being asked to fly an ordinary go-around instead, and the captain's mind was set on the wrong script. He pushed the throttles to maximum power, far more than a light, half-empty jet needed, while his first officer cleaned up the airplane for a normal climb. The 737 leapt skyward far faster and steeper than the captain expected, and from that moment, he began to fall behind it. What happened next was not the cinematographic illusion that has killed so many others in the dark. It was something quieter and stranger. Fighting to hold the nose at the right angle, the captain shoved his control column forward, and to do that, he had to press against the seat with all his strength, 50 pounds of steady force. He wanted to relieve that pressure. On the small airplanes where he had first learned to fly, the way to do that was to wind in some trim, and the force on the controls would melt away. So that is what he reached for, flipping the switches that tilt the tail, expecting the heaviness in his hands to disappear. But the 737 does not work that way. On this jet, trimming the tail does nothing to relieve the pressure he was feeling. The cue he was waiting for never came, and so he held those switches down, and held them for 12 long seconds, winding the tail further and further toward a steep nose-down setting, waiting for a feeling that the airplane was never going to give him. His first officer saw the danger and cried out, begging him to stop, not to do it. He did not seem to hear. When he finally let go of the switches, the airplane pitched violently over into a dive, hurling loose objects against the ceiling, and plunged toward the earth at full power. There was still time to recover, even then, but the captain simply froze. A disorienting sensation he had likely never trained for, and his mind locked up. He was awake and aware, yet unable to think or act. As the jet screamed toward the ground, his first officer was shouting at him to pull up, to pull, for God's sake, pull. At the last possible moment, the young man grabbed his own controls and hauled back with everything he had. It was not enough. Seconds later, Flydubai Flight 981 drove nose first into the runway at enormous speed and erupted into a fireball, punching a crater into the pavement. Nothing recognizable remained. The mystery that consumed investigators was how two capable, cautious pilots could end up here. The answer was unsettling precisely because there was no single villain. The airplane was flawless. The crew had done everything right for hours, but they had chosen to attempt a difficult landing in a dangerous storm at the lowest ebb of the night, when fatigue dulls the mind. And into that fragile state came a small surprise that sent the captain reaching back to an old habit from a different kind of airplane. He lost his picture of what his own hands were doing, and when it all went wrong, he could not move. The terrible lesson of Flight 981 is that you do not need a broken airplane or a reckless crew to die. Sometimes a good crew, a perfect machine, and a long, quiet accumulation of risk are enough. For 55 seconds, nobody flew the airplane. That is the heart of this story, and the most chilling thing about it. Two trained pilots sat at the controls of a perfectly healthy Boeing 737, climbing into a stormy African night, and for nearly a minute neither of them touched it or noticed that no one else was either. The jet rolled slowly, silently onto its side in the dark, and the men in the cockpit carried on talking as if everything were fine. By the time one of them realized the truth, there was no saving it. The flight was a Kenya Airways service leaving Douala, the largest city in Cameroon, late on a May night in 2007, bound for Nairobi with 114 people aboard. In the left seat was a captain in his 50s with well over 8,000 hours, a man known among his colleagues as overbearing, quick to belittle his co-pilots, and only a middling pilot despite his experience. Beside him sat a first officer barely out of training, 23 years old, with a few hundred hours to his name. It was a dangerous pairing, an arrogant senior man and a nervous junior one, and the cockpit recordings from earlier that very day had caught the captain calling the young man stupid and telling him to shut up. Thunderstorms were prowling the airport, and the crew had waited on the ground for the worst of the weather to pass. When they finally lifted off, They climbed out over a vast mangrove swamp, into a sky with no moon, no stars, and no lights below. Nothing whatsoever for the eyes to fix on. This is one of the oldest traps in aviation, and to escape it, a pilot must do one thing without fail: trust the artificial horizon on the panel, and never the feelings in his body. As the jet left the runway, it began very gently to roll to the right all on its own. Every airplane has small natural tendencies like this, and it was nothing the captain could not handle. Whenever he noticed the slow drift, he nudged the wings back to the left. But here, a cruel piece of physics came into play. A steady roll in one direction, in the dark, cannot be felt at all. The body simply does not register it. What the captain could feel were his own corrections, the little leftward nudges, and so his inner ear quietly built up the false belief that the airplane kept wanting to go left, when in truth, it was always creeping right. Then came the moment that doomed them. Focused on steering around the storms, the captain called for the autopilot to be engaged, but the young first officer, buried in the weather radar, never answered and never pressed the button. The autopilot stayed off, and now a fatal misunderstanding settled over the cockpit. The captain believed the autopilot was flying the airplane. The first officer believed the captain was flying it. In reality, no one was. For 55 long seconds, the 737 rolled steadily further onto its right side, smooth and silent and unfelt, while two men chatted on about headings and weather, neither one watching the instrument that was quietly screaming the truth. At 35 degrees of bank, an alarm finally broke the spell, calling out the dangerous angle. The captain looked up, startled, and in that instant, everything his body had told him betrayed him. His senses insisted the airplane was rolling left. His artificial horizon, right in front of his eyes, showed it banking hard to the right. Caught between the lie of his inner ear and the truth on the panel, he panicked and trusted the lie. He hauled the controls the wrong way, rolling further right, deeper into the turn. The airplane tipped past 90 degrees and rolled toward its back. Locked in that struggle, the 737 turned over and corkscrewed down out of the night. It struck the swamp at enormous speed, gouging a deep crater into the waterlogged earth and scattering itself across the marsh in thousands of fragments. All 114 people aboard died instantly. So remote and so sudden was the crash that no alarm was raised until the flight failed to arrive in Nairobi hours later, and it took nearly 2 days to find the wreckage, just a few miles from the airport it had left. What the investigation laid bare was not a failure of metal, but a failure of people, layered one atop another. There was nothing wrong with the airplane. The slow roll that started it all was trivial, the kind of thing pilots correct without a thought. What turned it deadly was a string of human gaps, a captain who lost his sense of which way was up and trusted his body over his instruments, a missing call that left no one flying the jet, and an authority gap so poisoned by insults that the one man who saw the danger clearly was too cowed to seize control until it was far too late. The airline, for its part, had every warning sign in the captain's troubled training file and had paired him with a green first officer anyway. The machine flew exactly as designed, straight into the ground, because the two people inside it never built the one thing they needed most: trust and the will to act on it. In every single crash, the same quiet truth waited at the end of the wreckage. Nothing had broken. The engines ran, the wings held, the controls answered every command. What failed was not the machine, but the fragile human mind tasked with flying it. A mind that lost its grip on something so basic, we never think about it on the ground. Which way is up? That is the strange and humbling lesson of these disasters. In the dark or in cloud with no horizon to anchor them, the human body becomes a liar. The organs in our inner ears cannot tell acceleration from gravity, and so a surge of engine power feels like a climb, and a gentle roll feels like nothing at all. Pilots are trained for years to ignore these false sensations and believe their instruments instead. But training is a thin shield, and under enough stress and surprise and fatigue, it can crack. Every crew in this video had the truth displayed right in front of their eyes, on instruments that never lied. And one after another, they trusted the lie instead. But look closer at these stories and you find something even harder to forget. In almost every cockpit, there was a second person who saw what was happening, a first officer who knew they were rolling the wrong way, a co-pilot who watched the nose drop and cried out. Time and again, one mind in the cockpit held the truth while the other chased a phantom, and the truth lost. Sometimes the words came too softly or too late. Sometimes they came clearly and were never heard. And sometimes the one who knew simply could not bring himself to seize the controls from the man beside him. This is why the answer to these tragedies was never simply better machines. The machines were already good. The answer was better humans. and better ways for humans to work together. Out of crashes like these came hard new rules. Pilots now drill the recovery from these exact illusions until the right response becomes instinct. They are taught to call out every change aloud, so that no one is ever flying blind beside a silent partner. And above all, the quietest voice in the cockpit was given permission to become the loudest, to say 3 words that can break the chain of disaster. I have control. So the next time you settle into your seat and the cabin lights dim for a night departure, and the world outside your window dissolves into total darkness, take a small comfort in this. Somewhere up front, 2 people are watching a glowing artificial horizon and narrating their every move to each other, ready to challenge one another the instant something looks wrong. They are doing it because of the lessons written in the stories you have just heard. Those lessons were terribly expensive. They were also learned, and they keep you safe tonight. These pilots were not fools, and they were not cowards. They were ordinary, capable people who met an extraordinary moment on the wrong night. And in that moment, they discovered the limits of the most complex instrument aboard any aircraft, the human mind. Remembering them is how we make sure their final moments still mean something, and understanding what happened to them is the surest way to keep it from happening to anyone else. Thank you for watching. If these stories moved you or taught you something new, consider subscribing to Terra Obscura